Sometimes making YouTube tech videos is about finding the cutting edge of performance. Other times it's getting the best bang for your viewer's buck, or finding the hidden gems that people haven't heard of. Sometimes the very thought of trying to give buying advice in the face of a disaster that's making building a new PC nigh on impossible for the foreseeable future makes you just want to say, F it and go live on a mountain. I can't do that. I'm British, our mountains aren't very big and they get rained on most of the time, so rather than try to fix a problem I have no answer for, I'm just gonna wallow in some of my favourite games using an old pre-built. As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a developer. I gave up that dream to join the family business of sinking passenger liners, but sometimes I wonder what my life could have been if I'd had a proper education in coding. This video's sponsor Boot.dev offers exactly that, a user-friendly learning experience for everyone regardless of experience. They take you from absolute beginner to seasoned expert in back-end software development tech like Python, SQL and Go. Learn in a gamified curriculum designed by actual humans to engage you and get you actually writing code rather than simply reading or watching tutorials. Who knows, after as little as 12 months with Boot.dev, you could go from writing nasty comments about game developers in the comments section of YouTube videos to reading them and taking them personally. Wait, I'm supposed to be selling this, aren't I? Boot.dev's tutorial content is absolutely free, and the full interactive course with AI tutor costs just £229 per year. Plus, you can use my code Iceberg to get a whopping 25% discount off the cost of the first year. Learn to code from home in your own time and in your own way with Boot.dev. Check them out at the link below or use the QR code on screen to find out more. This is an Alienware Aurora R8, a slightly fancier than usual Dell pre-built from around 2018. I had planned to talk about it as a platform for building a DIY Steam machine alternative, but the memory availability crisis, the loss of Crucial and the likely shortage of SSDs and graphics cards in the coming months makes talking about upgrades and performance at all just seem a bit hollow, you know? Did I choose this particular PC for this video because Alienware rhymes with despair? I think we both know the answer to that. I picked this one up for quite a lot more than it's worth. At £150 for a Coffee Lake i3 and an RX 550, it's a pretty terrible value, but it has some potential for aggressive expansion. What was crucial to me when planning this video was that I didn't spend any more money on it. I swapped out the solo 8GB stick for a matched pair I usually use in my DDR4 test rigs, exchanged the i3 for an i5 8600K I'd forgotten I'd bought, and traded in the RX 550 for a 6600 XT I reviewed late last year. Finally, the supplied storage was an old spinning Rust drive, and given the impending increase in SSD prices, it might be worth revisiting hard drive performance one of these days, but as this is essentially a comfort food build for me, I'm just gonna unplug the HDD and slap in my Bazzite SSD. You might potentially use this video as a kind of guide for building your own Steam machine, or gauging how well the real thing will perform in games, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm just dicking around with some parts I spent too much money on. This is not financial advice. I've talked before about how I'm an aging Star Wars nerd, and that the Respawn Jedi series are some of my favourite games of all time. I've now finished Jedi Fallen Order at least 4 times on various machines, and while I'm not quite ready to kick off playthrough number 5, it was tempting. CPU utilisation is pretty high, and as you can see from the overlay, the Alienware's cooling solution is really not up to scratch. The GPU, meanwhile, is doing just fine. I'm plugged into a 1440p display, and the game predates a lot of modern upscaling solutions, so if the 6600 XT weren't up to the task, I'd either have to use dynamic scaling or manually choose a lower resolution. However, it seems like we have more than enough performance to cover epic settings. The frequent stutters are, if anything, mainly the fault of the game itself. While nowhere near as bad as its notorious sequel, Fallen Order has more than its fair share of loading stutters, even with the framerate capped to 60 and VSync enabled. I did this for the capture footage in order to prevent tearing, because some people get confused that tearing is somehow a problem of the game or the hardware rather than just something benchmarkers have to deal with to get accurate frame rates. That being said, capping a game to 60 FPS can be useful in a system like this, where stressing the components can result in the PC running excessively hot and loud for the sake of just a few extra frames. The uncapped average of 75 FPS isn't too hard to take advantage of. Most people have access to 120, 144 and 165Hz monitors for reasonable prices these days. 75Hz monitors are very common secondhand, and you could even overclock a lot of 60Hz displays. But in this instance, I'd argue it isn't worth it. Britain doesn't get represented in video game environments very often, at least not outside of London, so Forza Horizon 4 has a place in the hearts of British gamers. Alas, you can't buy it anymore due to expired licensing agreements and the nature of online storefronts, but I managed to pick up a copy on Steam just before it was withdrawn from sale. Unfortunately, as my previous gameplay was all on Game Pass, and Microsoft are dicks, I lost dozens of hours of progress that I'll probably never get round to making up, especially with number 6 just over the horizon. 1440 Ultra is blazing fast on this system, but thanks mostly to the extremely high temps on the i5, it isn't a seamless experience. The average is a whopping 110 FPS in a race, but 1% lows are only half that, and the game doesn't feel at all smooth. Worse, the spikes affect sound, which means both the engine noise and the radio cut out from time to time. Running with 60Hz VSync enabled mostly fixes these issues, though I think this might be a good motivator to upgrade the CPU cooler. I didn't have time or space to install RDR2 on this SSD along with all the other games, plus I'll be featuring it in a future min-spec versus max-spec comparison video, so I decided instead to go with Red Dead Redemption 1. As someone who spent the late 2000s and early 2010s addicted to an MMO called EverQuest 2, I never owned a 7th gen console, so the long-awaited PC port of Rockstar's Wild West simulator was my first real opportunity to play the game. Refreshingly, it's not really a remaster, at least beyond the addition of a few higher settings that take advantage of PC hardware. Naturally, this means that the game still mostly looks and feels like a 7th gen console game, for better or worse. Just by looking at it you can tell that RDR is light work for the RX 6600 XT. Even cranked to maximum, the textures and model quality are very much of their era. Still, that means the PC has zero issue running the game at 1440, running over 100 FPS in the open areas and dropping to around 85 in towns like Armadillo. Several of my favourite games of recent years are ones that don't really factor into my usual content because they'll kind of run on a potato. I spent a fair amount of 2025 playing Dispatch, Silksong, and Thank Goodness You're Here, and frankly all of them would have run on this Alienware straight out of the box, no GPU or CPU swaps required. I also didn't need any of my upgrades to play Hades 2, which runs at basically the maximum FPS here, except perhaps in the opening area where it's a mere 200 frames per second or so. Of course, that doesn't matter so much, the game still plays perfectly well, capped to 60 for the capture footage, and I tested at 144Hz, which offered a nice boost to responsiveness without overly stressing the components. At 360 FPS, I'm not seeing much of a benefit on my 180Hz display, and the CPU fan kicks into overdrive, which kinda seems unnecessary. I personally am glad to see this type of game is getting more screen time these days, because otherwise the various discourses around tech stagnation, availability and pricing would make PC gaming a depressing hellscape for creators. Oh, wait. Of all the Bethesda-style first-person narrative games, the two I've spent the most time in are Fallout New Vegas and Starfield. New Vegas is an Xbox 360 era game that runs fine on a Steam Deck, while Starfield would struggle on this i5 whichever GPU I have installed, so instead I went with The Forgotten City. This game started life as a Skyrim mod and was then rebuilt as a standalone game using Unreal Engine 4. As gorgeous as it is, and as far removed as the ancient Roman setting is from Tamriel, you can still feel the Elder Scrolls DNA in there. While making this video, I accidentally played the whole game through to the end in about 7 hours, which isn't exactly productive behaviour, but it did give me an insight into performance. At first, 1440 Ultra seems very much possible. Without VSync enabled, the average is over 90 FPS, and capped at 60, it's a largely smooth experience, barring the standard UE stutter when moving around the level. However, later in the game there are pretty noticeable slowdowns, and not always in the busiest areas. Like I said, I managed to play the whole game without dropping settings, but if you're particularly sensitive to these things, then you might want to be a bit less ambitious than I was. I thought I'd throw in one modern demanding title for the hell of it. I completed the original Horizon Zero Dawn on PC a couple of years ago, and while I did spend the money to buy the remastered version in 2024, I never got round to playing it. Zero Dawn Remastered moves the original game into the new engine, featuring all the newly enhanced graphics of the sequel Forbidden West. This means that every character now has improbably good lighting 100% of the time. Presumably, drone-mounted studio lights are hovering just out of shot in every conversation, and yet, Rost's longbow still clips through his cloak, and Aloy's hair frequently rests on nothing. Misplaced priorities aside, the remaster does look excellent, though to get even a solid 30 FPS at 1440p demands the medium quality preset and quality FSR. Uncapped, the average is actually over 60, but the 1% lows are way down in the 40s, and some busier areas, and especially cutscenes, can drop into the 30s. Plus, these settings cause the occasional graphical problem that a more performance system wouldn't suffer from. As it is, the Alienware just scrapes into the recommended requirements, so I'm being a little unreasonable, asking it to churn out 1440p, and perhaps a more conservative output resolution or more aggressive FSRs in order. Oh, and one last thing to mention, there's apparently a known issue with AMD GPUs in Bazzite having audio problems over HDMI. I experience that occasionally when testing several games, though sometimes it's hard to separate what's being caused by the bug and what's being caused by this CPU throttling. In the case of Horizon, however, it was very clearly the bug. I was getting nothing but cutscene audio and system sounds over HDMI, and I had to swap the output to DisplayPort to fix it. My copy of Death Stranding is on my EGS account, and rather than paying for it a second time, I used the Heroic launcher, which allows this ostensibly Steam-exclusive operating system to run other launchers, including the Epic Games Store. The big issue was that I couldn't get Mango HUD to work with the Heroic launcher, and that's the only tool I know how to benchmark with on Linux. There's definitely a way to get it to work because it's right there in the options menu, but it throws up an error message, and I don't know enough about Linux to make it go away. Perhaps GameScope, the overlay built into Bazzite, which you've seen in all the other capture footage, perhaps it has some way of logging FPS, but if it does, I couldn't find any information on it. Eyeballing it, I'd say the average FPS in built-up areas is around the high 60s, and it can get spiky pretty often. Out in the American countryside, things loosen up a little, and the average is somewhere in the mid to high 70s. I needed to use Heroic one more time for my copy of Subnautica, but it's well worth the effort. This was my dissociation game during the pandemic lockdowns of 2021, where I'd escape the everyday drudgery and just drift through the glorious blue waters of an alien world, enjoying the music, collecting fish, and researching submarine parts and shit. I had more self-control this time around, so I only played for an hour or so, but I know from past experience that performance can drop in the later game, just like in the Forgotten City. At 1440 high, this system is only just pushing into the 60s and low 70s, But when things start to get busy, I could imagine them dropping into the 30s and 40s, so it might be worth dropping resolution or quality to be on the safe side. Alright, so I guess I should try and make this video useful to someone, so here are my thoughts. The R8 itself could be a good platform for a used parts build, but not a great one. There's a couple of PCIe power connectors, but not a lot of room or ventilation for the graphics card, so there are limits to how high you'd want to go when considering a GPU upgrade. The platform can support 12 and 16 thread CPUs like the i7-8700K and i9-9900K, which are still very relevant in this day and age, but the PSU is only 460 watts and the PCIe bandwidth is limited to Gen 3. This would put me off using anything with 8 lanes or less, so for a modern card, I'd look at the RX 9060 XT as a minimum. I'm not sure how well Intel cards work in Bazzite, as I haven't got around to trying them yet, so perhaps a B570 or B580 would be a viable budget alternative, and I'll be looking at GeForce cards in Bazzite soon, but I hear they're a pain in the ass, so while an RTX 3060 would be a viable option, I'm not going to be recommending it just yet. The clamshell arrangement of the power supply and small interior space mean this case can't support most tower coolers. There are some server and OEM coolers that fit, but I've watched other people's videos on them and frankly this PC is loud enough already. I don't want to voluntarily turn it into a screaming banshee. I have a 120mm liquid cooler that requires fully disassembling the PC to install, so perhaps I'll return to this PC in the future with the specs maxed out and see what it's really capable of. For now though, the i5-8600K is doing okay for the most part, but an 8700 or 9700 would go a long way to solving some of the spikes in the frame time graph, and the stock cooler simply couldn't handle them. With the overclock setting enabled in the BIOS, temps can sometimes pass 90 degrees, which Intel might tell you is okay, but I won't. Should you go out and buy an Alienware Aurora R8 to turn into your very own Steam machine? No, probably not. A regular old Dell will do a similar job for less money. A fat precision workstation like a 5810 or a Lenovo P510 would be better value with better cooling and potentially more room for expansion. And you could build something for not much more money that would do a superior job all round. But that brings up the problem of buying parts and trying to find RAM for a reasonable price, and now I'm spiraling again. So it might not be good value, but was it the chill, relaxing, comfort food gaming experience I'd hoped for? Hell no. Perhaps if I weren't trying to benchmark these things, I'd have had a better time. My miserable Linux skills weren't enough to solve problems when they came up, and nothing ruins a fun gaming session like having to stop for an hour to search for solutions on Reddit. That being said, with the pathetic stock cooler clearly being pushed beyond breaking point and screaming at me the whole time, I still think this would make for a less than chill experience, even without having to deal with Linux problems. I'm definitely going to have to try out that liquid cooler. Thanks again to Boot.dev for sponsoring the video. Check them out at the link below, and don't forget to use promo code Iceberg to get 25% off your first year. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.